Right, a couple of years ago I made a video about the balanced compounds. Turns out the sound quality was questionable on large format and indecipherable on cell phone format. So I said to myself, first opportunity you get, re-record it. This is that opportunity. Find my notes, we'll get into it. Okay, part 3, although I've already done part 4 and possibly part 5. There are 4 types of balanced compounds according to this book, but there's also this type here which I've found subsequent to that, but I'm sticking with the 4. Of them, I'm going to be looking at 3, because one of them is the von Borries system, about which I know next to nothing. The deGlehn Bousquet system used in New Zealand on the New Zealand government railways in 2 classes of balanced compound locomotives. Also, more famously and more renowned in a world context, used on the Chemin du Nord with their particularly renowned 442 express passenger locomotives. That class came into service in 1900, hauling boat trains between the Channel ports and La Gare du Nord in Paris, which is both magnificent and a railway station. Those Nord-Atlantics were one of only 2 occasions when a locomotive or a locomotive class drops from the sky and causes the locomotive world to sit up and question what that world thought they knew about efficiency and efficacy. Those Nord-Atlantics were not new, so to speak. They were a maturation of steady development on the Nord, made by deGlehn and Bousquet in the decade and a half preceding their introduction. And it's a class through which a golden thread can be drawn that ultimately ends up with those classic late steam French locomotives built under the tutelage of André the Giant of Steam Chapelon. When news of those Nord-Atlantics fell onto the pages of the North American trade literature, Mr. Cole from what would soon become Alco and Mr. Vauclain from Baldwin rushed out and secured patents for their take on 4-cylinder balanced compounds. So von Borries, deGlehn Bousquet, Cole and Vauclain. So let's get into it. You'll remember the Vauclain compounds from the last episode, or actually 3 or 4 episodes ago now, with a pair of high and low pressure cylinders on each side of the firebox, high above low or low above high depending on clearance, each sharing a common valve. Each pair drove a common crosshead, thus 1 drive pin on each side of the locomotive for a total of 2. Vulcan's 4-cylinder balanced compound was a rejig of his patent from a decade and a half earlier. This time the 4 cylinders were lined up in a row beneath the smoke box, low pressure on the outside, high pressure in the middle either side of the center line. The valves were snugged up against the high pressure cylinders. It makes them really hard to find on a photograph, but if you squint, there they are. And under them and inboard you'll see the high pressure cylinders. There were 4 driving rods, 1 for each cylinder. So we have driving pin on the driver's side, crank between the bearings inside the frames, and a driving pin on the fireman's side. They all drove the same axle, they were all evenly spaced. Thus there were 4 power impulses giving a more even, or to use the term, a more balanced drive signature compared with the 2 drive points of the previous Vauclain types or the tandem compounds or a simple locomotive. That balance allowed for locomotives that could run at a higher speed without encountering the counterbalance issues that a 2-drive locomotive would. So the initial iterations of the 4-cylinder balanced compound type on North American roads tended to be racy Atlantics like these ones here, and some were small enough to drive the lead set of driving wheels, thus making use of the room between the trailing axle of the lead bogie and that first driven axle. Thus plenty of room for all that internal motion and maintenance thereof. But when roads called for 6 coupled balanced compounds, what with increasing weight of trains and increasing timetable demands, two things happened. First, that space dried up for maintenance. And second, the center axle needed to be driven to preserve the most advantageous angularity for the drive rod driving wheel relationship. So Vauclain used a bifurcated driving rod for the inside cylinders, and yes, that gap is the gap through which the leading driving axle passes. The Cole system of balanced compounds was more based on the tandem compounding system with its 4 valves and 4 cylinders. Outwardly, the 4 valves in the Cole system were an advantage over the Vauclain arrangement, but of course those valves were inextricably linked to the 2 on the outside, so the advantage was more illusionary than real. That essentially doubling up of 4 valve motions into really 2 valve motions was something that deGlehn was critical of, and I'll get to that in a bit. Cole had a divided drive, the high pressure cylinders driving the lead axle, the outside low pressure cylinders driving the next axle in the series. And balance was provided by moving the high pressure cylinders from here under their valves around and up a bit to the pilot deck where they lay next to each other either side of the centre line and within easy reach of their valve. They too drove cranks on the leading coupled axle because they were set far enough forward to do so, thus eliminating the need for a bifurcated rod. The outside cylinders drove drive pins on the following set of coupled wheels. Very few of the Cole balanced compound types are built, thus there's very few photographs. This is literally it, although there are a few floating around for when they were converted to 2-cylinder simple. So Cole had a divided drive, as did deGlehn. Vauclain and Von Borries had their drive concentrated, and there's an interesting difference of opinion between Von Borries and deGlehn on the one hand about the efficacy of their drivers in terms of flat spotting, which is a phenomenon that occurs 90 degrees apart from the crank pin, and it's where the thrust of the locomotive drives the wheel set backwards against motion and then over the top pulls it forward with the motion, and this causes flat spotting in the points where that under and over force occurs. Thus, after a time, a locomotive needs a visit to the wheel lathe to even things up again. Von Borries and deGlehn claimed that having their drives concentrated eliminated or lessened the tendency to flat spot. Cole and Vauclain claimed otherwise. This debate unfolded in the pages of the North American trade literature, 125 years ago, so who the hell knows who's right. The marketing point for the first iteration of the Vauclain compound, the tandem compounds, the cross compounds, was that the in-cab experience for the driver, save for the addition of an intercepting valve, was the same as that for a common 2-cylinder simple locomotive. Thus, one regulator, one reversing lever. Thus simplicity, but that outward simplicity came at a cost. Because compounds have a happy zone where they are the most efficient, and that happy zone is set on the design table. Short of manipulating the reversing lever, there's not much that the crew can do to control the relationship between the high pressure engine and the low pressure engine when the locomotive is out on the road earning its keep. Best I can tell is that the balanced compounds in North America had done their dash by 1912 with this class of Pacifics on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe. So a decade or so from the patents being issued to them passing out of production. And it's worth noting that those 1912 locomotives didn't actually follow the patent. The road required the inboard cylinders to be placed on a higher inclined plane, similar to what you find with the inside cylinder on the Union Pacific Big Nines, for instance. So the motion, the valve motion and the drive could peak over the top of the leading axle, thus avoiding the bifurcated drive rod. Interestingly, both the 1912 class and its preceding class were superheated. And there's a school of thought that says that superheating did for compounding in North America. And the logic goes something like this. Imagine an 1890s freight drag locomotive out on the road, hauling as much as it could haul at about 10 miles per hour. The upfront cost of compounding such a locomotive is this much, but the benefits out on the road are this much. But if you try to run that sort of locomotive at a higher speed, hauling more faster, the benefit shrinks down to this much. But with a superheated locomotive, the upfront cost is this much, but the benefit out on the road, regardless of the sort of traffic you're putting the locomotive on, is this much. And because superheating is a static system, essentially no moving parts, it has a lesser maintenance burden. So why pay that for something that's going to cost you more with no particular benefit when you can pay that much for something that's actually going to produce those benefits? Now, all of that was fair and true in North America, but it certainly wasn't the case in France, or a lesser degree the case in New Zealand. Our compounds on the New Zealand government railways lasted in their compound configuration until World War II, where a process of conversion to 2 or 4 cylinder simples began. But that is after service from essentially 1906 through to 1942 or so. Whereas in the North American experience, the balanced compounds were simplified much, much earlier. And in the case of the Atlantics, they were simply given the heave-ho. So let's have a look at the design circle and service expectations for those famous Nor Atlantics and see if we can figure out why the difference between Vauclain and coal was so marked when compared to those Nor locomotives. Okay, so here's a list. Rubbish coal, light rail, poor road bed, lowish speed limit, heavy boat trains, long hill climbs, and tight schedules. Poor coal required a wide firebox, or at least a larger firebox, thus the need for a trailing axle. Poor coal means that the heat generated is both precious and limited. This dictates the length of the boiler barrel. Because of those factors in combination, the steam generated is also precious. The need to run at speed dictated a 4-wheeled leading truck. This also was dictated by the relatively tight axle loadings on the Nor and the fact that you have 4 cylinders up front, heavier than 2 cylinders or 3 cylinders. Now, the Chemin de Nor had been developing compound locomotives from the mid-1880s because the poor quality of their permanent way required that smoothness that balanced compounds could bring. So with the trailing axle and the leading axles determined by its service requirements and its weight requirements, and the length of boiler barrel dictated by the amount of heat that could be produced, we end up with a 4-4-2 combination, or in France, a 2-2-1. The road speed on the Nor was set to about 74.5 miles per hour, or exactly 120 kilometers per hour if you prefer. And the weight on the drawbar was set by the importance of those boat trains in the transport link between London and Paris. So the Nor Atlantics needed to start swiftly. They needed to climb like a cat up the grades. They needed to run freely along the easier sections. Thus, they needed to be flexible. When you look into the cab of those French locomotives, you'll notice 2 regulators. For when in startup mode, the exhaust from the high pressure cylinders was exhausted up the chimney and boiler steam was supplied directly to the low pressure cylinders, thus creating, for startup at least, a 4-cylinder simple. Those Nor Atlantics were classy starters. By contrast, the Baldwin-built balanced compound Atlantics were slippy beasts that often had to operate in pairs in order to ensure that they could get their trains into motion. In the French cab, you'll also find 2 reversing levers. Thus, the footplate crew could manipulate the relationship between high pressure engine and low pressure engine. They could configure the locomotive for the start. They could configure the locomotive to climb like a cat. They could configure the locomotive to run freely and sprint right at the edge of the authorized road speed, all while maintaining an economy in fuel and water that would make Baldwin or coal blush. deGlehn was aware of the criticism about complexity and maintenance, and responded that both were overstated. The complexity was worth the effort as far as he was concerned, and he saw benefits in the complexity. Although, to be fair, he's comparing those benefits of his type with the 4-cylinder North American types. His valves were 4 straightforward valves, whereas the 2 Vauclain valves had 8 separate steam seals each, which demanded steam tightness far beyond that required by the deGlehn Bousquet system. deGlehn Bousquet actually used slide valves for the low pressure cylinders. And deGlehn's point about all those seals in the Vauclain system was that it took real effort to push those valves back and forth, and real effort to maintain that number of seals. That effort came from the eccentrics, and it robbed power from the locomotive. And because of the amount of effort required to move the valve motion, its journals ran hotter, required more maintenance. What the Santa Fe found with their 1912 types is that the valves, as they arrived from the manufacturer, couldn't cope with the higher temperature of superheated steam, and that's what led to their early conversion to 2-cylinder simples. Whereas in France, and to a lesser extent in New Zealand, we found that the deGlehn valve systems could cope with superheated steam. In the French experience, superheating and compounding went together, and very good compound locomotives simply became even better superheated compound locomotives. So that diminutive little locomotive on the Chemin de Fer du Nord, which caused the locomotive world to sit up and question what it thought it knew, set the scene for all of those French locomotives to come. Whereas in North America, the balanced compound technology, which was a rehash from technology a decade and a half older, ceased to be by 1912. And with those locomotives on the Santa Fe, 4-cylinder balanced compounding in North America hit its evolutionary dead end. And a benchmark locomotive similar in effect to those Nor-Atlantics did not hit North American rails until the 1920s. And that locomotive is the second one to cause the locomotive world to sit up and take notice, and it was the A1 superpowered demonstrator from the Lima Locomotive Works, located in Lima, Ohio. But in terms of double engine compounding in North America, that period from roughly 1904 or so to 1912, pretty much paralleling the balanced compound experience, was the chrysalis period that set down the basis from which compound complexity, divided drive, and superheating emerged, and which was embraced on the Norfolk and Western with a design thread that resulted in the ultimate expression of that type in North America, the Y6B. And that design thread will be covered in the next episode, except that I'm redoing this, so I've already covered it. It will be in possibly the last episode. So there we are, that's the story. Hope you liked it. I hope you appreciate it with hopefully better sound. Give it a thumbs up if you did, like, subscribe, enjoy, check out some other videos. Cheers, see you later.